So in the previous parts of this chapter, this is the Openstax Biology, chapter 14.3. These next two sections, 14.3 and 14.4, cover the seed plants. So before we were covering the seedless plants, these are the seeded plants. And the first major group is the gymnosperms. And gymnosperms are like Ginkgos and Cycads and Conifers. They have the cone-like reproductive structures, and their cones have pollen and they have sperm. So previously we had talked about adaptations for plants on land, and I feel like we covered that really well in the last video, so I'm not going to talk about it again here. But just understand that specifically cone-bearing plants, which are gymnosperms, which are often like, you know, what you think of a pine tree. Some people, you know, celebrate, you know, Christmas and they have like a Christmas tree. You can think of it as being one of those type of, you know, wintry, snowy mountain type of trees. These trees also have to be well adapted for drought conditions, because when they're way up high in the mountains, sometimes you think, well, snowpack, they should have tons of water, but not really, because when it's packed like snow, the tree cannot uptake that water. It is frozen. It can't bring up that water. And then additionally, when there is the warm summer, that snow has melted, and because it's so high up, gravity has taken all that water down the hill. So these trees have a limited amount of time in spring and fall to usually take up water, so they also have to be very drought tolerant. So a lot of times their needles are actually leaves that have modified to become needles. They're very waxy on the outside to, again, hold in the water like a cactus, and it's very shrunken down so that it doesn't transpire very much and lose its water. So these are very abundant on land, and gymnosperms have pollen and seeds, but no flowering stage. So there's no flowering stage here, but they do have, you know, cones. So pine cones, what is the purpose of this structure? Pine cones actually house an embryo that, let me go back to my slideshow and show you. They actually house an embryo covered in a seed coat, and fertilization, through this process of fertilization, it can actually take sometimes a few years for that fertilization to take place. So the seed coat protects the seeds, and the female gametophyte provides the nutrients for the growing embryo. So you know, it's got, you know, two parts of that seed. So they're very diverse. There's a few pictures in this slideshow that I want to show you. One of them is the conifers, which are the cone-bearing plants. They tend to live at very high altitudes. They're really well known. They're used a lot because it's a very fast-growing wood, but it's considered kind of a softer wood. Then there's also the cycads, and I think that I brought up, I think I have a picture of the cycads. Well, the slideshow has it. A lot of times the cycads are actually mistaken for palms. Here's various cycads. They get really, really big, and a lot of people think that they are palms. They are not. These are not palms. These are cone-bearing plants, and you can see the huge cone here. And these cycads are actually highly endangered at this point. There's not very many left on the planet. People are not planting very many of these in their yards and things because they get so large. But to me, I love the way they look. If you had a lot of property, it would just be so cool. These totally look like a tree that was around when the dinosaurs were there. And they might not be around for much longer, just because of how endangered they are. And they are actually pollinated by beetles, not by wind. And they tend to have to live in a very mild climate, so they can't live in quite the extremes of other places. Something that I didn't mention about the cones that I want to go back to, on a pine tree, and I'm trying to see if I can find a good picture of them going up a mountainside. I guess this is okay, but let me see. Not in love with the density here. Okay, this is an okay picture. Okay, so pine trees tend to have the male cones at the bottom of the tree and the female cones at the top. Well, why is that? Then the sperm is going to have a hard time floating up here to the female cones, and that's exactly why they do it. It is so that this pine tree that's up here, its pollen, which is down here, is about the same height as this tree that's further down. That tree's cones, the female part, the female cones. So the pollen of the tree higher up is fertilizing the cones of the tree a little further down. And so it's always like cross-pollinating. So it's really to bring some genetic diversity to the species. Okay, so the next group that I want to talk about are the ginkgos. And the ginkgos, there's only one. There's only one surviving species. In fact, I don't know that there's any of these in the wild that have grown naturally in the wild. They were cultivated for thousands of years by like Buddhist monks and things, like kept these because they are actually a really, really pretty tree. And there's only one surviving species of this. The male actually is usually planted. The male version is usually planted all over. The female is actually not planted very often at all, because the female version of this smells really, really bad. The book says rancid butter. I don't know. It's just a bad smell. It's just a bad smell to me. Then there's one called the Neophytes, and I will bring up a picture of this. This isn't that pretty, right? It's not that pretty. So not many people grow this, but they are actually used a lot of times. Like if you've heard of Ephedra, they have ephedrine, which is a drug that's used. It's very similarly in a lot of prescription drugs, so it was used anciently a lot of times as a medicine. But again, this is another plant that if you saw it out in the desert or something, you would think it is nearly dead when it's actually doing fine. So people don't use this ornamentally in their yards very much. This is one that your book mentions and has the same picture, called Ephedra, and it was also used by like early pioneers as a medicine. Okay, so the next group that I want to talk about are the angiosperms, the classic flower-bearing plants that are doing quite well. We as humans like to plant these a lot in our gardens because we love all of the flowers, and they make flowers and fruit. So the purpose of the flowers is to attract a pollinator that will carry the sperm, which is the pollen. Like when you breathe in, have allergies to pollen, what you have an allergy to is plant sperm that's floating through the air. That's what's making you sneeze. And if you don't have an allergy to it, it means you can sniff a lot of plant sperm and it doesn't seem to bother you. So it specifically floats through the air or connects with a pollinator, and then it fertilizes a flower. So once it has been fertilized, let me see if it's got a new picture. Okay, it's got a new picture. Okay, once it has been fertilized, the plant will usually make a seed. Sometimes it will make a fruit. And the purpose of the fruit, when it's like an edible fruit, the purpose of the fruit is, it's a lot of work. Why is the plant producing this large, fleshy fruit? Basically, the plant is hoping, though the plant doesn't actually hope, but the adaptation is that it is wanting to attract a pollinator or an animal that will come and eat this fruit, and then it will go through the animal's digestive tract, and the animal will travel far away from the plant and leave it in a defecated pile of feces, in other words, the animal's poo, and that will be a fertilizer and provide fertilizer for the developing seeds that were inside of the fruit. So that is the goal, is to get the plant far enough away, provide it with fertilizer so it'll use a lot of its energy to produce this fruit to make it possible. And then, of course, as humans, we just go and buy it off the shelf at the grocery store and throw the pit in the trash. So we're not doing our job at all, and hopefully flushing the feces down the toilet. So we didn't do anything to help this whole process, but that's what the plant was going for. Okay, so it's also important to know that in botany, a fruit is a fertilized and fully grown, ripened ovary. You're eating the ovary. That's what you're eating when you eat fruit. And many foods that we call vegetables are vegetables agriculturally, because in the United States they are taxed. Vegetables are taxed different than fruit. However, a lot of the things that agriculturally we call a vegetable, botanically, they're actually fruit. So some of those are like eggplants, zucchini, string beans, bell peppers. Lots of those are actually fruit, not vegetables. We just call them that. So we'll just go with it, right? Because they tax you differently. So we'll just go with it. Okay. So again, the ovary, which is like the fruit, is the protective chamber that forms around the seeds. So angiosperms specifically, and I want to show it here. Angiosperms also, they're unique in that they have a double fertilization. One fertilization basically makes the developing embryo here by that little yellow part. It's like the developing embryo, and the rest, the secondary fertilization makes the food source inside the seed. This becomes really relevant when you read about archaeology digs and things where they find ancient vessels of seeds that they can sprout, and they're maybe 2,000 years old or something. So they'll find a vessel that had like seeds in it, and they'll try and grow them. They're 2,000 years old. That is a living thing. A seed can survive, in some cases, that long. Not all seeds, but some can. And they can live that long that tiny little embryo is alive inside, and there's that food source that it's living on. It's just one of those fascinating things. So here's an enlarged version. I should have done that first. This is the developing embryo. This is the endosperm that the embryo lives off of, and then there's a very protective seed coat. And some plants have extremely, like wheat is one, has a very thick, hard seed coat, and that seed can live for a long time. Okay, next, there's a couple different ways that we distinguish angiosperms, monocots, and that's monocots and dicots. So specifically monocotyledon and dicotyledons. Monocotyledons have one seed part and dicotyledons have two seed parts. So if you think of like a corn kernel, that's a seed. It's got one seed part, right? But if you think of something like like edamame or something like that, then you can actually like bring the two halves of the seed part apart, okay, so that you can separate it. So there's two seed parts there. So generally monocots have parallel leaf veins or parallel venation, so you can almost see in this flower that it's a little bit parallel. But in dicots, they have very branched leaf veins throughout it, like what we saw in the last chapter with most leaves are like that. So here's some pictures that you guys can go through and look at. Well, actually, before I get to that, these are Basil angiosperms, and they are very fragrant. They're tall trees. They are used in spices, sometimes herbs, like you can think of like a laurel tree, which is like, you know, anciently what they used in the Olympics to crown victors. Um, Cinnamon, spice bush, the avocado, they're very fragrant. And then to look at some monocots. Well, some of these, yeah, some of these are mono and some of them are not. Something like grasses, that's going to be a monocot, but this like daisy is not. It's like a dicot. So I'll show you the difference in this chart because they do have a good, oh, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't in the slideshow. Maybe that's the end. So I brought up the chart separately over here. So monocots and dicots, if you do a search on Google, you'll find you know, charts that show you one side versus the other. Monocots will have scattered veins when you cut the leaf at the bottom. And dicots, their stems will grow in rings, like a tree with rings. So you can think of those as being like a dicot. So parallel leaf veins is a monocot, and veins that go all over the place is a dicot. Monocots with these parallel leaf veins. When I was a kid, I would kind of rip some of these because you can rip the leaf and it'll rip straight down in a straight line. So the flower parts of monocots are in threes or in multiples of threes, whereas in the dicots, it's fours or fives or multiples of fours and fives. So you can actually pull off the leaf parts, and this one will have, monocots will have, you know, 3 or 6 or 9. And a dicot will have 4 or 5 or multiples of 4 or 5. So you can actually count like the petals on that.